Coming up on this Wednesday edition of Newsline at noon, lawmakers rush to pass dozens of bills, including some aimed at bolstering the economy on the final day of the annual regular session. But the spirit of compromise was short-lived, with the ruling party submitting a motion to expel 2 opposition representatives. US lawmakers reach a bipartisan budget deal to prevent another government shutdown. The deal has yet to be approved by the full Senate and House of Representatives. Plus, tens of thousands of people and world leaders, past and present, celebrate the life of Nelson Mandela in a massive memorial service in Johannesburg, days before Sunday's state funeral. These stories and more on Newsline at noon.
Where's the best place for bibimbap?
Les Jeux Olympiques d'hiver se dérouleront-ils à Pyeongchang?
هل أنتم حقاً سابع أكبر مصدر في العالم؟
この歌手は誰ですか？你好，最近哪部电视剧的人气最旺？
Korea is attracting interest from around the world. The more you know, the more you want to know. Dynamic Korea.
Thanks for joining us. You're watching Newsline at noon. I'm Chae Yusan in Seoul.
Very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broom. Let's start things off at the National Assembly, where dozens of bills were finally passed on Tuesday, on the last day of the annual regular session.
This comes despite unrelenting tension between the rival parties over some highly controversial remarks made by 2 opposition lawmakers. Our Park Ji-won has the details.
The National Assembly passed 37 bills on its very last plenary meeting of the annual regular session. The bills include several related to boosting the nation's real estate market and several others that aim to bring about the vision of cultural enrichment, one of key national goals set by President Park Geun-hye. Those include a basic law on culture and a revised copyright law. Revised bills on the sustainable development of Dokdo and the management of livestock products also passed the Assembly. Remaining bills will be dealt with at the legislature's provisional sessions beginning this Wednesday until January 3rd next year. The passing of 37 bills was possible as the floor leaders of both parties met and agreed on Tuesday afternoon to go ahead with parliamentary schedules as planned, despite the controversy over remarks by 2 Democratic Party lawmakers against President Park Geun-hye. DP lawmaker Jang Ha-na, referring to allegations that the National Intelligence Service meddled in last year's presidential election, called the election a fraud. She demanded that President Park step down and called for a fresh election. Another DP lawmaker, Yang Seung-jo, said that should President Park refuse to listen to the people, she could meet the same fate as her father, the late President Park Chung-hee, who was assassinated. In response, the ruling Saenuri Party has filed a motion at the Assembly's Disciplinary Committee to expel the 2 DP lawmakers from Parliament. The motion, signed by all 155 ruling Conservative Party members, strongly condemns their remarks, saying they agitated the constitutional order of the country and impaired the honor and authority of the National Assembly. The Democratic Party expressed regrets over the ruling party's action, saying the motion was based on partisan interests. It added the remarks did not warrant being kicked out of the National Assembly. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
While it's widely believed the recent purging of the North Korean leader's uncle Chang Song-taek was part of Kim Jonguns' efforts to solidify his own power, some are offering a differing view that the ousting was a collective decision by the military. Our Hwang Sung-hee reports.
The German ambassador to North Korea, Thomas Scheffer, says he believes North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was forced by hardliners in the military to purge his powerful uncle Chang Song-taek. This runs contrary to the belief that the young leader ousted Chang to consolidate his own status as the regime's one and only ruler. Speaking at a seminar in Berlin on Tuesday local time, Scheffer explained that North Korea is under a collective leadership system and said Chang's purging signals the military's tightened grip on power. According to the German diplomat, the military was threatened by the regime's push to open up the North Korean economy and to strengthen cooperation with China. Chang was a key player in dealing with Beijing. Experts say Chang's dismissal will inevitably deal a huge blow to North Korea-China relations. Chang was known to be in charge of a joint economic zone with Beijing near the Chinese city of Dandong, with plans to bring in North Koreans to work in Chinese factories. However, progress has been slow, and just before Chang first went missing, Pyongyang announced a new separate economic zone at Sinuiju without consulting Beijing. With Chang officially gone, other joint business efforts could be for the chop. This, experts say, will add to China's growing frustration with its neighbors' ongoing economic woes and its refusal to give up its nuclear ambitions. But they say Beijing will not let go of Pyongyang for now. As much as the cost of sustaining its isolated neighbor may have increased and the benefits decreased, the potential consequences of cutting North Korea loose are unpalatable to China. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
The number of people who found jobs here in Korea soared by nearly 600,000 in November, the largest pace of expansion in more than 1 year. Data from Statistics Korea shows that 588,000 more people found work last month from a year earlier, bringing the number of employed in the nation to over 25 million. The agency attributes the surge to more recruitment in the public health and social welfare service sectors. The youth unemployment rate, however, rose to 7.5% in November, up 0.8 percentage points from the previous year. Korea's import prices dropped to their lowest level in more than 3 years last month, helped by the strength of the local currency and a fall in oil prices. The Bank of Korea says the country's import price index stood at 99.14 in November, the lowest since April of 2010. It was down 0.5% from a month earlier and 4.9% from the same period of last year. Export prices also dropped by an average of 0.8% last month from October, marking the fifth straight month of decline. The Korean won closed at a 28-month high of 1,052.2 to the dollar on Tuesday.
The Korean government will revise rules in designating small and mid-sized enterprises to better support their businesses and growth. Finance Minister Hyun Oh-suk said Wednesday that the current regulations based on the number of employees, paid-in capital and other production factors are outdated. The government is considering using a 3-year sales average as the base for designating SMEs. But the ceilings for qualifying as an SME will vary for different industries, ranging between 38 million and 143 million US dollars. SMEs are eligible for tax breaks and other benefits offered by the government. With Korea's energy consumption expected to double by the year 2035, there have been questions over whether the country will increase its reliance on nuclear energy, reduce it, or leave it as it is. Our Kwon So-ah reports on the government's plan for the nation's nuclear future.
Korea, the world's fifth largest producer of nuclear electricity, will be even more reliant on nuclear energy in the future. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy on Tuesday released its nuclear power energy plan for 2035 to the National Assembly, and it shows a growing dependence on nuclear energy. Currently, Korea's reliance on nuclear power stands at 26%, with 23 plants that are either operating or undergoing maintenance. The government's plan is to increase that reliance to 29% in the year 2035, which would require a total of between 40 and 42 nuclear power plants. 11 plants are already under construction or in the planning stages, meaning 5 to 6 more on top of that total will have to be built. A working group made up of citizens, industries and educational bodies recently suggested a nuclear energy reliance range of between 22 and 29%, taking public acceptance into consideration. The government's 29% rate is on the high side of that scale, but far less than the aim set forth by the government under former President Lee Myung-bak. It had set up a 41% aim. There have been concerns about the continuous construction of nuclear power plants in the country at a time when other nations are retreating from nuclear power. Germany, for example, is planning to close down all plants in its country. Meanwhile, there also have been issues concerning failed quality tests of nuclear reactors and corruption in the sector. However, the government says that due to the country's industry structure, nuclear power is a cheap and efficient source of energy. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
The strike led by Korea's main railway union entered its third day on this Wednesday, disrupting train services. Korail, the state-run railway operator, says its freight train service volume has dropped to nearly 70%, while its passenger services have dropped to 64% of normal levels. The strike was prompted by Korail's decision to allow a subsidiary to operate new bullet train routes departing from southern Seoul. The union sees this as the first step towards the eventual privatization of Korail, which they say will result in fare hikes and mass layoffs. Other transport unions, including the Seoul Subway Labour Union, will join the strike starting next Wednesday. A new report has ranked Korea 46th on a global scale for corruption in the public sector. The good news for the country's image is that Korea has slid down the rankings over the past few years. Paul Lee reports.
Korea is making steady strides towards stamping out corruption across government agencies and institutions, but public perception on the matter has been on a slow decline. In its most recent annual review, Transparency International dropped Korea one notch in its global rankings for relative degree of perceived corruption. Korea had previously ranked 39th on the Corruption Perception Index back in 2010, but has since fallen 7 places to 46. The head of Transparency International Korea, Kim Go-sung, says the consecutive fall is due in part to a series of high-profile corruption scandals over the last few years. Kim cited the corruption case of Korea's state-run operator of nuclear power plants that led to the shutdown of several reactors and pushing the country into an energy crisis this past summer. This year, Korea scored 55 out of 100 on the Corruption Perceptions Index, which measures the perceived level of corruption in the administrative and public sectors. The score takes into account 13 opinion surveys by global experts and business people. Korea also came in 27th when compared to the 34 member nations of the OECD, unchanged on year. When comparing all 177 countries in the report, the global watchdog said Denmark and New Zealand were the world's least corrupt nations. In order to improve its ranking, experts recommend that Korea establish an independent anti-corruption organization and strengthen oversight of high-ranking officials. Paul Yi, Arirang News. For your fill of Korean and international news, join Chae Yu-sun and Mark Broom every weekday at lunchtime. NEWSLINE at noon.
Plenary session this Wednesday and vote on the government restructuring bills.
Lawmakers in the U.S. have reached a budget agreement that could, if passed by the House and Senate, remove the threat of another government shutdown come January. Our Yoo Ri-an has the details.
Tuesday was a pivotal day for the U.S. Congress as the announcement of a bipartisan budget agreement could finally bring some order back to the nation's chaotic budget process, which has been dominated for nearly 3 years by short-term deals and shutdowns. If passed by the House and Senate, the deal will most likely allow the United States to avoid starting the new year with another government shutdown on January 15th, which is when government funding is expected to run out. The new budget agreement, worth $85 billion, will increase military and domestic spending over the next 2 years, replacing unpopular spending cuts known as the sequester with other savings.
From the outset, we knew that if we forced each other to compromise a core principle, we would get nowhere. That is why we decided to focus on where the common ground is.
By setting bipartisan spending levels for the next 2 years, this deal allows congressional committees to proceed under regular order and gives government agencies and the companies that do business with them the certainty they need to hire workers and make investments.
Sticking points remain, however, as conservative Republicans criticize the deal as a retreat from the sequester, and Democrats want an extension of long-term benefits for the unemployed that expire later this month. It also does not address the volatile issue of the nation's borrowing limit, known as a debt ceiling, and a new limit will have to be approved by Congress sometime early next year. The House is expected to vote on the deal later this week, followed by the Senate. Yurian, Arirang News.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is asking Congress to shelve plans to impose new sanctions on Tehran while Washington looks for a long-term solution to the Iran nuclear issue. Speaking to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Tuesday, Kerry pleaded for lawmakers to give U.S. experts the time and the space to do their jobs by holding off on imposing new sanctions. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle have raised concerns about last month's deal between Iran and world powers, under which Tehran would curb its nuclear program in return for relief from U.S. economic sanctions. The Obama administration hopes the interim agreement, set to last 6 months but renewable for a further 6 months by mutual consent, will provide time to negotiate a final deal with the Iranians within a year. Tens of thousands of South Africans braved the heavy rains in Johannesburg on Tuesday to remember Nelson Mandela, the man who set their country free. U.S. President Barack Obama led the praise, calling Mandela a giant of history. Our Shin Se-min has the details.
Thousands of mourners, including dozens of presidents, prime ministers, and celebrities, descended upon Johannesburg Tuesday to say their goodbyes to Nelson Mandela. The public memorial service was held at First National Bank Stadium, the place where Mandela gave his first speech after being released from prison and his last public appearance at the closing ceremony of the 2010 World Cup Finals. Despite being a memorial service and despite the rainy conditions, the mood at the stadium was both joyous and festive. A wave of people came together mirroring Mandela's global message of reconciliation. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, US President Barack Obama, and some of Mandela's relatives gave speeches honoring the former South African president.
It is hard to eulogize any man. How much harder to do so for a giant of history who moved a nation toward justice.
We join together in sorrow for a mighty loss and in celebration of a mighty life. What a wondrous display of this rainbow nation.
Before his release in 1990, Mandela spent 27 years in prison fighting for freedom. And in 1994, he was elected the country's first black president of the post-apartheid era. Mandela passed away in his Johannesburg home last Thursday at the age of 95. He will lie in state for 3 days before being laid to rest in his ancestral village of Kunyu on Sunday. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych has talked about resuming talks with the European Union, a move aimed at diffusing the protests shaking his nation. But he's still insisting on strengthening ties with Russia. Our Kim Min-ji has the latest.
Ukraine and the European Commission are expected to resume talks Wednesday on a partnership deal aimed at integrating the country into the 28-nation bloc after Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych said he would send a delegation. In a televised meeting with 3 former Ukrainian presidents Tuesday, Yanukovych also indicated his willingness to sign the EU deal if the EU can provide better financial terms. Yanukovych's decision to walk away from the deal last month in favor of closer ties with Russia was what triggered the massive protests now rocking the capital of Kiev. Thousands of protesters have continued to camp out in the freezing cold in the city's Independence Square. Hundreds of police have moved in on protesters, dismantling barricades and causing clashes early Wednesday. Yanukovych said he will arrange the release of protesters arrested during the demonstrations, seen as an attempt to defuse the ongoing crisis. However, despite saying he remains committed to European integration, Yanukovych has again said that his government needs to deepen ties with Russia. He said that Ukraine cannot talk about the future without restoring trade relations with Moscow. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton are both in Ukraine to seek ways to defuse the crisis. EU officials said Tuesday they are willing to give Ukraine more financial assistance if it signs a proposed trade deal. The International Monetary Fund also said it is ready to offer Ukraine support if the country implements the needed reforms. Ukraine said that it will resume negotiations with the IMF, but Yanukovych has reiterated that the conditions put forward by the IMF were unacceptable. The president's response follows new reports claiming that the Ukrainian government successfully secured bailout financing from China and Russia, which could replace the IMF aid. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
US banks will be prohibited from making big trading bets with their own funds after regulators finalized the Volcker rule and shut down what had been a lucrative source of revenue for Wall Street before the global financial crisis. After more than 2 years of working on the highly complex rule, 5 regulatory agencies gave the go-ahead to the reform that includes tough new sanctions narrowing the scope for legitimate trades. The rule is expected to take a significant bite out of revenues at large investment banks, such as Goldman Sachs, even if many had already wound down some of their trading desks in anticipation of the rule's release. Reform advocates are very happy with the final rule, calling it a major defeat for an out-of-control Wall Street. For the first time in General Motors' over century-long history, the company will be run by a woman. GM announced Tuesday that it has named 51-year-old Mary Barra as its new CEO to replace Dan Ackerson, who will step down next month. The move to make Barra CEO makes GM the largest company in the US to ever be headed by a woman. Barra, who was barely old enough to drive when she joined the company in 1980, has worked her way up to become the global product development chief and has received praise for her leadership. A snowstorm in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States that has killed at least 11 shut schools and federal offices in the country's capital and elsewhere along the eastern seaboard on Tuesday. Up to 25 centimeters of snow piled up in some areas after a wave of heavy snowfall swept through the nation. And over the weekend on Monday, federal government offices were shut and school districts in Washington and Maryland also called off classes due to dangerous road conditions. More than 1,600 flights were also cancelled. In Oklahoma, 11 deaths from traffic and other weather-related accidents were reported.
And the snow this morning in the Seoul metro area made for a tough morning commute, but it's mostly gone now. But other regions around the country are still receiving snowfall.
Yes, that's right. And let's see how long we're going to have this snow with our Jian, who's standing by at the Weather Center. Good afternoon to you, Jian.
Well, good afternoon, Mark and Yusa. Now, for drivers on a snowy day, there's no right speed to be traveling when it's snowing, so please slow it down. And you should also double the normal distance between your car and the next and check the road conditions before you set out on your journey, no matter how short. Well, in addition to the 3.3 centimeters of snow we had in the capital region this morning, we had some strong gusty winds driving temperatures down, and the afternoon high in Seoul will be only hiking up to 1 degree Celsius this afternoon. And there were heavy snow advisories around the country this morning, but they've since been lifted, though there still is one in effect on Jeju, and it's still snowing in parts of Chungcheongdo and the western parts of Gangwon-do, which should let up as we head into the late afternoon. But it will snow again tomorrow. It will start snowing before noon, mostly in the inland region, and will likely turn to a freezing drizzle, but the precipitation should be less than today. With that in mind, here are the readings for today. The high in Seoul this afternoon will be a chilly 1 degree, while Gwangju and Daegu will get up to 5, and Busan climb into 8. Now let's see how other regions are looking. It looks like Jeju will get up to 9 in the afternoon. Daejeon and Dokdo will reach 4 and 6, and there's a freezing cold day in store for Mount Kumgang, topping out at -7. Now that's all for Korea. Korea, and here's the global forecast for viewers around the world. That's all for me today. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And back to Mark and Yusan in the studio.
Thank you, Gian. And that's it for this Wednesday edition of Newsline at Noon. Join us again tomorrow for headlines making news here in Korea and around the world.
And we'll have more news coming your way in the afternoon.